Hey, Nursing Leadership Scope and Review team. Ian Gordon here, providing a video to provide context at your own leisure of how we're going to move forward with screening, and at the end I'll talk about the exercise to come as well. So why are we doing this scope and review? This particular article in 2005 identified 4 reasons. 1, to examine the extent, range, nature, and availability of research on a topic or question. We're kind of doing that. Determine the value of undertaking a full systematic review. Probably not relevant here, but a stepping stone for many people. To summarize and disseminate research findings across a body of research evidence. I think that's a big part of what we're doing. To identify research gaps in literature, to aid planning and commission of future research and applications to scholarship, education, teaching, curriculum, practice. You can add whatever you want there. So there's more than one reason to do a scoping review. It's always good to have this context and why are we doing this work. They asked the same group, why are you doing a scoping review? And if you can see the percentage and ranking of why they're doing it, explore evidence, research, 4% of the people in this survey identify key themes. So are we not only answering the research question or questions, but you can't help but look forward and saying, what are we going to do with this particular research? Are we going to add to the scholarly research base? Are we going to emphasize practice? Are we just wanting to publish a scholarly peer-reviewed article? We've talked about many things, and they're all relevant, but you can't help but not think of why we're doing this as well. There's many steps in evidence synthesis, and we're just kind of halfway here. We started the objectives of the research or question, eligibility, what do we want to include, or screening, excluding protocols as well. We've kind of played with those. Identified all potential eligible studies is I've kind of done the research and found a number of studies I'll talk about in a minute. Screening for inclusion and exclusion. Since this is a framework or protocol or best practice in evidence synthesis, we all got to be on the same page, and we have to document how we move forward with including the studies we want to review for the intended purpose. How do we want to exclude things? We'll talk about that again. Things to do is extracting data, screening studies, appraising, analyzing, studying, percolating. We probably won't have a statistical analysis, but preparing a structured report for research or a manuscript for publication as well. We're a long way from ending there, but we're doing a great job. So here's our research question or questions. What is known from the existing literature about theoretical leadership courses offered in nursing curriculum, either undergraduate or graduate level? Okay. Second research question, what is known from the existing literature about research practicums, experience, or learning in nursing and curriculum, either at the undergraduate or graduate level? Great research questions. There's gray areas here. There's ambiguity here. So we can answer these research questions, but really narrowing down our research questions to a particular issue or problem or concern or research evidence is really important. We need to do this before we actually start the screening process. So here's the database results based on the studies and the research that I've done. We search 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 databases, and we've got a number of citations put to one side. It chose not to use Scopus. It's not a ROC. We could if someone had access to it, or we could get it. We've identified 102 seed articles amongst us, either through identifying key research seed articles, either by methodology, source, subject, disciplinary knowledge, or things that are really of interest. We looked at forward citations screening of 26 of these articles and found 102. So I think we've done well there. We didn't limit any of these searches in the numbers other than by English and by format, looking at scholarly articles. And it's estimated there's 6,528 citations to go through, but approximately half, I think more than half, are duplicates, and Covidence helps us to dedupe or reduce these as well. So that's kind of where we are right now. Screening is really important, and in every evidence synthesis project, we want to maximize our reproducibility, our transparency, and rigor. We want people to do the same search over the same databases using the same screening criteria, getting the same results. Hard to do, but that rigor is really important, and a framework of evidence synthesis work. We want to eliminate or limit the amount of bias, whether it's personal bias, group bias, institutional bias, in these surveys, in these citation screening, and throughout the whole study. And that can be tricky to do because we're working as a team, but we're working as individuals. We're working within a body of knowledge that has changed over the years, has intended or institutional or personal biases. And so really, those are the frameworks. So at every question, at every screening, at every results, and every publication or manuscript, we want to ask ourselves, are we introducing too much bias? And usually we tend to comment on that in the manuscript as well. So we're doing inclusion exclusion criteria. Inclusion criteria are elements of resources that must be present in order for the needs of your topic, study, or assignment focus to be included. The other things is the article peer-reviewed? Hard to determine. Published in the last 5 years. We haven't really figured that out. English language. Well, but there's many English language citations and abstracts that have Portuguese throughout the full text. So that's hard to do. Resources focused on studying a specific population. We kind of know who we're studying, but even that's open for interpretation. The word inclusion criteria, when we move through titles and abstracts, and then go through full text citations, we tend to use the same inclusion and exclusion criteria at those two stages. Yet, I've worked with many teams where the inclusion criteria has changed or been adjusted from the screening of titles and abstracts to the screening of full text publications as well, and that's okay as well. Screening using the inclusion is usually all versus any. So each citation you look at should include every one of these elements. And so you go yes, 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 and yes, and we'll include it. Exclusion criteria are elements or resources that, if found, would disqualify them from being used in this final review. Things like that are maybe not inclusion criteria, which is okay, letters to the editors, huge studies, popular things, methodologies that don't really relate to the research that we're doing as well. In the exclusion criteria, inclusion is all, exclusion is any. So if any of the citations meet any one of these attributes of the exclusion criteria, you click on no or exclude from the study. So it's all versus any, inclusion versus exclusion, or you can look at it yes versus no. Hopefully this makes sense to you as well. We really got to have this hammered down. So here's our exclusion criteria as I've surmised so far. We're looking at English only, nursing, how we would define nursing, scholarly. We kind of hem and haw about commentary, so we'll look at that. So citation study is linked to this research. Well, that may be redundant, but yet it has to deal with our research question or questions. Exclusion criteria are types of nursing education programs. We're kind of hem and hawing with geographic location, if our study's relevance to populations, let's say in Africa or Japan or the Third World or the Philippines. We're looking at excluding things maybe outside the North American or First World environments. Exclude reported outcomes that are not consistent with the research study question. Well, again, that's kind of redundant, but we include that in the exclusion. Things we're looking at, notes we need from you as well. And this is what you do as you move through the screening. Types of action, single longitudinal studies which count. Do we include evidence indices reviews, scoping? Usually they don't, but should we? International literature, we kind of talked about that. Yes or no? Timeframes. The research team has kind of thought of 2013 as a cutoff zone, but that's tricky for most teams to do. Our research screening now is for all studies, for all time periods as well. Practicums, experimental leadership management, another question we need to work out. And that's okay. It's good to work these things out now. Here's an example of a covenants page. It's not from this study, it's just a screening study I've used for other studies. So a citation comes up for our screeners, titles and abstracts. Here's the citation, and here's the abstract. That's all you have to know. At the bottom left, you can make a note or keep your own notes if you want. And you see it says not include, exclude. It says yes or no. So no, we don't want to include this. Yes, if we do want to include it. And that's all you get. And so independently, you won't know what another screening member does or decides. It's all anonymous, and the software helps us to do that. And it tells you the number of the study in the top and the author, primary author, and the year. And it gives you much information you know. There's maybe in there as well. So as we set up the screening protocols, and we've got a team working at that, you may want to say maybe, meaning I can't decide, or I don't have enough information. It's always good to choose maybe. So maybe is kind of like a yes. It's a conditional yes. But our screeners to look at the final analysis If two screeners, if we're doing this, or three all say yes, goes in as yes. If all three of you say no, it goes in as no. But if one says maybe, if one says no, or one says yes, someone will break the tie. And then there's a screening process for that as well. So here's an example of full text screening, and the screening team for this particular study has decided include or exclude. There's no maybe here. And so what you tend to do when you do full text screening, you look at the full text of the article, and the full text is uploaded or it's available to you as well. So it takes a bit more time to do this as well. Sometimes there's 3 levels of screening. You do 1 level of screening, titles and abstracts. You screen them again, titles and abstracts, or maybe a different person does them. We kind of talk about this as a team, but when we come to the final screening of full text items, usually our including and excluding criteria are pretty well set. We kind of know how we're thinking. We're limiting bias, and we're increasing the transparency and reproducibility of how we do this as well. Covenant software, I know this is hard to see, but it tells everyone who does what, and this is what the Covenant's setup team does, who makes decisions, who can break conflicts or ties. Sometimes some people, if you have so many, some people does the first 100 and somebody does the next 100. You rank and sort the citations in the software different ways, so there's different ways of doing it, but at some point, this is all done, and so allows you to screen independently, not knowing what anybody else has done, allows you to screen today, tomorrow, tonight, as often as much as you want until you're done, which is really nice as well, so it keeps your place. Here's a progress chart for you. Here's an example of one where someone's gone through as many that resolved, if you haven't resolved, there's 301 yet to include, and tells you what stage of the screening you are. So, and we're not extracting data from this particular Covenant's practices, but that's usually the 3rd stage. Titles and abstracts. Full text is another. When everyone's done the title and abstract screening, everyone jumps in who's a screener to the full text review, and then we kind of decide what we've done. Here's another review progress. It just looks a different way. This is how I look at it. It says how many decisions I've made, how many things I've done, how many things I got left to screen. So it just gives you a different way of looking at it. And the settings or the exporting and all those decisions have been made by the Covenant's setup team. At some point, some people, when they do title and abstract screening, they include a set of, on the right-hand side, of criteria for excluding. So every time you would say no, it would come up with this chart and say, why did you say no? And these are predetermined categories. You could say it's not related, it's too old, it's not in English. That's kind of tricky, and that's good information for your numbers at the very end. And usually there's another category. And so you add this to your Prisma flowchart. I would suggest not doing this, but it can be done. So sometimes when you say no, then you're asked further. So at the end of it, everyone knows why people said, how many said no, and why they said no. And it's cumulative, and it's anonymous as well. So here's the full text screening. We've kind of seen this before. It tells you bulk uploads, so the screening team helps with that. And so you don't have to search for a citation. You don't have to search for an abstract. You don't have to search for the PDF. Hopefully, it'll all be there. It usually happens most of the time. Full text screening conflicts, just as there's conflicts to be screened for titles and abstracts. This is where somebody else on the team would jump in and do the full text screening. So you can go from a huge number down to a small number, and then someone would screen these as well, making a final decision. Here's Prisma flowchart. I know it's hard to see, but we started with 6,500 studies. We dedupe half of them. We get down to 2,900. You screen titles and abstract. You've got down to maybe 600. And then you do full text screening, or you do another level of screening. You come down to 14, and you have 7 at the end. This Prisma flowchart is actually generated in Covenants, but it's nice, but it doesn't really have to be there. You can take the numbers and create your own Prisma flowchart as well. So the big test is how many start out with, how many do we screen out, and how accurate, limiting the amount of bias, increasing the amount of reliability, do we get at the very end. I've worked with teams that have 154 at the end, 54 at the end, 7 at the end. So it's hard to tell. You can't predict this, but again, you can't screen all 6,500 or 3,500. It has to be a reasonable number, or it just gets too easy, or we have to ask our questions. Do we use the inclusion and exclusion criteria appropriately? And ultimately, we ask ourselves the research question: have we answered a research question or questions? So here's questions that we should discuss, or I always ask myself. What do I do if I can't make up my mind to include or exclude? Well, a screener, that's always, it's bound to happen. And in this study, I found it'll probably happen more than obvious. Well, we need to talk about that as a group, and that's why we do a practice session. What notes do I keep and where do I keep them? Well, you can keep them in Covidence because you have your own account and you have your own profile. Some people scribble them on a newspaper, on a piece of paper, keep them in the notes. It's always good to keep notes, and the notes would be, I wasn't sure about this, we should ask the team about this, or this is a really, really, really important study, but it's to be deleted, or I'm supposed to say no, and I just can't bring myself to do that. So those are things we bring back to the team. How many citations do we screen, include, end up with? I kind of talked about that. It's hard to tell, but there is a trend or a pattern to follow. Here, I often ask myself, screening's taking forever. Is this just me? Well, studies have indicated that screeners can do 100 to 150 citations, titles, and abstracts an hour. I don't know. I would find it hard to do that, but that's the average. And so people do it on the phone, the mobile device, on a computer, on a laptop. It keeps track, and so there's always a record, and it tells you where you are, so you don't have to worry about doing it by a particular date or as fast or as slow as you want. Something we should talk about is screening. Screening is taking forever. Is this just me? We'll talk about that certainly during our practice session. We'll certainly talk about this after the first level of screening as well. So here's the exercise. I said all that to say this. With the research study sample citations and abstracts, screen each entry, and based on the screening criteria, include or exclude or maybe for each citation. I'll send this by email, and I'll send you 10 citations that randomly picked, or may pick some that aren't random. And so I want you independently say include or exclude based on our research questions and our screening protocols. What would you decide? You'll retain your notes if that helps. It's always good to keep that on a piece of paper or just independently. And email your decisions of all these citations separately. So don't email them to the group, email them to me, and I'll collocate them, and then I'll share during our discussion purposes. If it's just the screeners or everyone would like to get in on this discussion, we'll talk about that before we actually dive in and actually do a screening. We'll discuss group discussions, so your notes and your experiences as a group will be important as we need to kind of nail this down going forward. I think we have more than enough to do. I think this is an awesome research question or questions. Formulas is shaping this into a really good evidence synthesis report, a manuscript, or discussion paper, or as evidence to take on another study or a conference, or just to share with your colleagues. I think we're there. We just have to kind of narrow this down. We have to limit the amount of bias so that we're providing answers, good answers to good questions. So I'll send you this video, and I'll send you the examples as well. So email me at any time. I'm always available. I look forward to working with everyone.